when we try to picture how a civilization is actually built, we usually default to this really comforting, almost sterile image.
Right, a very sanitary way to view history.
Exactly. We picture, like, an architect unrolling a neat little blueprint. You lay down the foundation of laws, you stack the bricks of commerce, and then eventually everyone just works together in polite, quiet harmony.
Yeah, we definitely crave that illusion, the idea that human progress is just this gentle, cooperative upward slope driven by, consensus.
But then you actually open the history books and you
Yeah.
look at how the foundational ideas of the Western world were forged, and that neat little blueprint just bursts into flame.
It really does.
Yeah.
The reality of our intellectual history isn't some polite roundtable discussion.
No, it is a hostile, aggressive, completely unapologetic forge.
The mortar holding those foundational bricks together wasn't pleasant agreement at all. It was a relentless arena of debate.
Right.
It was driven by this deeply competitive instinct to just tear down weak ideas until only the truth remained standing.
Before we get started on unpacking exactly how that forge operated, make sure to like and subscribe so you never miss a deep dive.
Yes, definitely do that.
Today, our mission is to take a massive journey into a highly provocative, deeply fascinating new ebook. It's titled Enlightened Hostility, a red-pilled manifesto of masculine verbal aggression, and it's by Conrad Riker.
It is quite the read.
It really is. And I want to be entirely upfront about the landscape we are entering today. If you are a listener who is engaged with the men's rights movement, the manosphere, or if you're just, invested in understanding the history of our institutions before they were captured by feminist and Marxist ideologies, as the author argues.
Which is a heavy claim.
Huge claim. But this book is engineered specifically to grab your attention. We highly recommend you check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy a copy. And definitely be sure to follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack.
But before we dive into the actual substance of the text, we really must establish some ground rules for our discussion today.
Yeah, very important.
Because this manifesto contains heavily politically charged content. It wades directly into the absolute most intense, fiery debates occurring right now between left-wing and right-wing ideologies.
It doesn't pull any punches on feminism, traditional masculinity, or institutional power.
Not at all.
Yeah.
So, to be crystal clear to you, the listener, we are here to impartially report on and deconstruct Riker's arguments. We are not taking sides.
Right, no sides.
And we are not endorsing the viewpoints presented in the book. Our goal is strictly to unpack the intellectual architecture of this manifesto. We just want to lay its machinery out on the table and understand exactly why these concepts are resonating with such massive force today.
Okay, let's unpack this, because Riker isn't just, offering a few self-help tips for modern men here.
No, not at all.
He is attempting a total ground-up reevaluation of Western history. His core thesis is that the institutions of the West didn't just coincidentally happen to be built by men.
Right.
He claims they were explicitly biologically designed on a foundation of masculine logic and what he calls verbal combat.
And the tragedy of the modern era, at least according to Riker, is that this entire operating system has essentially been hijacked.
So how does he set up that original operating system? He uses a specific metaphor, right?
Yeah, to illustrate that foundation, Riker uses the metaphor of an intellectual trireme.
A trireme, like the ship.
Exactly. For context, a trireme was this ancient Mediterranean warship. It was devastatingly fast, highly maneuverable, and it was powered by 3 banks of disciplined, synchronized rowers.
So he uses the ship as a symbol for the state itself.
He does. He argues that Western civilization was propelled forward by the disciplined, rational minds of men. And he divides this patriarchal inheritance into 3 distinct historical epochs.
Starting with the Greeks.
Right, starting with the Greeks.
Now, when we think of the Greeks, we usually think of Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, the heavyweights. But Riker argues they didn't figure out the universe by just sitting in a circle sharing their feelings.
Far from it. They utilize dialectic.
Which is what exactly in his terms?
Well, dialectic is a method of aggressive, logical cross-examination. It's aimed purely at discovering objective truth. Aristotle, in particular, formalized the laws of logic.
So he basically gave men the tool set.
Precisely. He gave them the structural framework to take an irrational concept, isolate its flaws, and dismantle it piece by piece. The Greeks provided the stars to navigate by basically objective, verifiable truth.
Okay, so the Greeks mapped the stars, then Riker brings in the Romans as the second bank of rowers.
Yes. If the Greeks were the philosophers, Riker paints the Romans as the engineers and the enforcers.
Right, because you need someone to actually build the thing.
Exactly. The Romans took that lofty Greek philosophy and they essentially bolted it to the physical earth. They contributed Stoic pragmatism, really complex civic law, and brutal military governance.
They proved that a functional republic doesn't just need good ideas, right?
Right, it requires unyielding men who are willing to enforce order, maintain the borders, and crucially, do so silently, without demanding emotional validation.
That Stoicism piece is huge in his argument. And then the third bank of rowers on this trireme would be the Enlightenment thinkers.
Yes, moving up to folks like John Locke, Francis Bacon, Isaac Newton.
They bring the scientific method to the ship. I mean, Bacon's publication of the Novum Organum in 1620 essentially declared that human beings shouldn't just passively observe nature anymore.
Right, we must subjugate it.
Exactly, using empirical data. We test, we break, we measure.
And Riker frames the scientific method as the ultimate patriarchal tool. He sees it as the absolute rejection of superstition and emotional sentiment.
Because it demands that reality actually be proven.
Exactly. And the fuel for this entire historical progression from the Greek dialectic to the Enlightenment laboratory is a concept Riker calls the agon.
Verbal combat.
Yes. In the ancient world, disagreement was not viewed as an act of violence, which is a huge contrast to today.
Oh, massive contrast.
It was actually considered the highest possible form of respect. By bringing your absolute best, most ruthless counter-arguments against an opponent, you were signaling that you viewed them as an equal.
You assumed they were a rational adult.
Right, a rational adult capable of surviving the crucible of debate.
I have to play devil's advocate here, though, because if you take that concept into the modern world, people are going to push back incredibly hard.
But without a doubt.
Isn't verbal aggression or unfiltered debate often just a dressed up, intellectualized excuse for bullying? I mean, if I picture a high school locker room where guys are just absolutely tearing each other apart with insults, and then I picture a formal debate stage, I need to know where Riker actually draws the line.
It's a fair question.
Because today, unchecked verbal hostility is almost universally labeled as toxic behavior.
Well, Riker anticipates that exact pushback. He draws a very rigid boundary between actual toxic bullying and what he categorizes as the male insult hierarchy.
The male insult hierarchy, okay.
Yeah. And he accuses the modern sociological framework of deliberately conflating the two just to pathologize normal male behavior.
So how does he define true bullying then?
True bullying, as he defines it, is a unilateral, malicious attack. It is punching down at someone weaker with the specific intent to permanently harm them and exclude them from the group.
Okay, so bullying is just raw destruction, no productive value. But what is this male insult hierarchy then? How is, like, tearing your friend apart over a game of poker considered constructive?
He describes it as a bilateral consensual stress test.
A stress test.
Yeah, think of it as an evolutionary holdover, an upgrade from primate dominance displays. When men ruthlessly mock each other in that locker room setting, they're engaging in a high-trust bonding exercise.
So they're simulating a conflict.
Exactly. They are simulating a life or death crisis, but they're removing the physical danger. If a man can absorb a brutal, highly personal insult from his peer and fire one back without losing his emotional composure, he proves to the tribe that he is stable under pressure.
Wow. Okay, Riker calls this the ego-antibody mechanism, and that is an incredibly vivid analogy.
It really is.
It's exactly how the human immune system works. If you take a child and raise them in a perfectly sterilized, hermetically sealed plastic bubble, their immune system never encounters a pathogen.
Right. They never build defenses.
So the second they step outside, a basic common cold could be fatal.
And that biological reality maps perfectly onto Riker's view of male psychology.
Right.
The male ego requires regular microdosed exposure to harsh criticism, mockery, and friction to actually develop psychological calluses. It needs friction to grow dense.
So the insult is literally the vaccine. It integrates men into the group.
Exactly.
He actually points out that male aggression is incredibly high trust. Like, if a guy has a problem with you, he will usually just tell you to your face and then it's resolved.
Yes. And he contrasts that with what he calls female-coded politeness, which he views as fundamentally low trust.
Because it masks covert resentment.
Right. Psychologists call it relational aggression, the gossiping, the reputation destruction behind the scenes.
By exploring this, I mean, Riker is offering an explanation for a very specific modern phenomenon.
He is. For why so many individuals today feel an intense exhaustion with the constant demand to walk on eggshells.
Yeah, the pressure to pre-filter every single thought for fear of causing offense.
Riker argues this exhaustion is actually biological. unfiltered, occasionally hostile debate feels natural to men because it is the evolutionary mechanism designed to build resilience. It is not a glitch in male psychology. He says it is the core feature.
Okay, so if this intellectual trireme, powered by raw debate, the scientific method, and this male insult hierarchy, is responsible for the towering achievements of Western civilization, we arrive at the central mystery of the manifesto.
The big question.
How did it all derail? I mean, how do we go from the rigid logic of Aristotle and the mathematical certainty of Isaac Newton into what Riker openly derides as a gynocentric cult of fragility?
Well, Riker points his finger directly at the year 1937.
1937? Why then?
That is the year he claims a silent mutiny occurred on the ship. The Frankfurt School, which was a group of intellectuals associated with the Institute for Social Research in Germany, who later relocated to the United States, began widely disseminating Marxist critical theory.
For listeners who might hear Frankfurt School and critical theory thrown around a lot in, political spaces, but don't quite know the mechanics behind them, what exactly did they do, according to Riker?
Well, Riker argues that traditional Marxism focused on economic class struggles, right? The workers against the factory owners.
The classic proletariat versus bourgeoisie.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the Frankfurt School realized that economic Marxism was basically failing to take hold in the prosperous West. So they shifted the battleground from economics to culture. Critical theory was designed to relentlessly critique and dismantle the traditional institutions of society, things like the family, religion, law, by framing them entirely as systems of oppressive power.
So rather than building a better argument, the goal just became deconstructing the idea that objective truth even exists in the first place.
That's his claim, yes. Riker claims they rammed the trireme straight into the reef of subjective emotionalism.
He paints this picture where the new intellectuals didn't want to build a faster ship at all. They wanted to turn the state into a leaky lifeboat where everyone drops the oars to just sit and weep about the waves.
That's a very evocative way to put it.
And he links this cultural shift directly to what he calls female-coded leftism.
Yes. The mechanism of this capture is fascinating. Riker posits that society took a localized, deeply necessary biological instinct, which is the maternal drive to protect a vulnerable, fragile infant, and irrationally scaled it up.
Scaled it into a macroeconomic and legal framework.
Exactly.
Right, because if you have a newborn baby, your hypervigilance and desire to shield it from absolutely all harm is what keeps the species alive. You need that.
You absolutely do.
But when you apply that exact same maternal psychology to governing a nation of grown adults, the system collapses. He argues that the modern state now views grown men as unruly toddlers, and the government has basically positioned itself as the omnipresent smothering mother.
And this smothering mother instinct immediately sought to sanitize the environment. Riker traces this directly to the erasure of male spaces and the legal pathologizing of male behavior.
He gives some very specific examples of this.
He does. He cites the 1980 Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC, their guidelines on sexual harassment. And that was followed by the 1986 Supreme Court case, Meritor Savings Bank v. Vinson.
Okay, but how did those specific legal shifts operate in practice? Because, on the surface, preventing harassment sounds like a universally good thing.
Riker argues the text of these regulations was rapidly weaponized way beyond their stated intent. They were used to create the concept of a hostile work environment based purely on subjective feelings.
Okay, so it moved away from objective harm.
Exactly. The rough and tumble banter, that ego antibody mechanism that builds camaraderie, was suddenly legally redefined as a corporate liability.
So human resources departments just exploded in power.
They did. He says they started acting as the high priests of a sanitized culture. They sterilized the workplace, making natural masculine interaction literally a fireable offense.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Riker says the left didn't just capture the HR departments. They executed what he calls epistemological hijacking.
Yes, this is perhaps one of the most vital concepts in the entire book.
He argues the left didn't even try to step into the arena of debate to win using logic. They just quietly stole the dictionary and rewrote the definitions of words.
He leans heavily on the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein here. Wittgenstein famously noted that the limits of our language mean the limits of our world.
Which makes perfect sense.
Right. If you cannot articulate a thought because the vocabulary has been removed or altered, you literally cannot hold that concept in your mind.
Let's make this concrete for a second. Look at the word violence. Historically, violence meant physical force intended to hurt or kill.
Physical force, yes.
Today, Riker points out, Academic institutions have redefined words they simply disagree with as literal violence. Or look at the word toxic.
Well, that's a huge one for him.
Yeah. If a man is being aggressively competitive and stoic, traits that used to define leadership, the new dictionary labels him toxic.
It is an insidious, strategic masterstroke, according to Riker. He argues that you cannot possibly dismantle an opponent's ideology if you have already surrendered the linguistic framework they are using.
Yeah, if they get to define what equity or harm actually means, they control the perceived reality of the entire culture. Objective truth is just replaced by a subjective plaything. It's like sitting down to play a game of chess, but mid-game your opponent decides their pawns can move exactly like queens because they feel the traditional rules are oppressive.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
You can't win because you aren't playing the same game anymore. They completely control the board.
And this linguistic manipulation perfectly bridges into his attack on the most ubiquitous phrase in modern culture, which is toxic masculinity.
Right.
Riker does not just complain about this phrase, he attempts to systematically destroy it using formal logic.
He builds an Aristotelian syllogism. For anyone who hasn't taken a philosophy 101 class recently, a syllogism is just a logical argument that applies deductive reasoning to arrive at a conclusion based on two premises that are asserted to be true.
Exactly. And Riker lays it out very clinically. His major premise is this: traits that build civilizations, protect borders against invaders, and drive technological innovation are objectively virtuous.
Which is hard to argue with. I mean, if you don't have those things, your society is either conquered or it starves.
Right. Then his minor premise, traditional masculinity, which he defines as controlled aggression, strict stoicism, and a willingness to engage in hierarchical loyalty, uniquely embodies and provides those exact protective traits.
Therefore, the logical conclusion.
Traditional masculinity is objectively virtuous. Right. Riker claims it is mathematically impossible to refute this without rejecting the basic laws of nature. He views the label of toxic masculinity as a manufactured, pseudoscientific fallacy.
Because it was designed by a culture terrified of male authority, seeking to basically tame the very men who protect it.
That is his argument, yes.
But he doesn't just rely on cold logic to make this point. To prove that masculinity is protective and not predatory, he brings in these incredibly haunting, visceral historical events.
He really takes aim at the modern feminist narrative here.
Yeah, the narrative that history is just one long, unbroken timeline of men maliciously oppressing women for their own benefit.
He uses the concept of male disposability to shatter that narrative. The most striking example he gives in the text is the sinking of the HMS Birkenhead.
The Birkenhead, what happened there?
On February 26, 1852, this British troopship struck an uncharted rock off the coast of South Africa. The hull was completely ripped open, the water rushed in. There were 643 people aboard, including soldiers, their wives, and their children.
And there were only enough functional lifeboats for a fraction of the passengers, right?
Exactly. When it became clear the ship was going down, the commanding officer ordered the soldiers to fall into rank.
On a sinking ship.
On a slanting, sinking deck.
Yeah.
They stood at strict attention. They did not rush the lifeboats. They stood like statues, while every single woman and child was safely lowered into the water.
That is unbelievable discipline.
They stood there maintaining absolute discipline until the ocean literally swallowed them. 440 men died. Every woman and child survived.
And he parallels this with the RMS Titanic in 1912. It's the exact same code. Women and children first.
Yes.
Men stood on the promenade deck, smoking cigars, listening to the band play, fully accepting the freezing water so that the women could live.
Riker demands the reader look at these events and asks, does that look like malicious oppression?
It's a powerful question.
He asserts that patriarchy wasn't a system of female exploitation at all. It was a system of absolute, mandated male sacrifice.
He calls the historical reality a gynocentric matriarchy disguised as a patriarchy, where men were expected to do all the dying, only to have their sacrifices erased by modern sociologists.
To anchor these historical anecdotes in broad empirical data, Riker turns to the work of cognitive psychologist Steven Pinker, specifically his 2011 book, The Better Angels of Our Nature.
Pinker's extensive data proves that humanity has experienced a massive, undeniable decline in violence over the centuries, right? You are far less likely to be murdered today than in the Middle Ages.
Correct. But the mainstream narrative usually attributes that piece to us becoming more enlightened.
More empathetic, getting in touch with our feelings, building social welfare programs.
But Riker entirely rejects that empathy explanation. He utilizes Pinker's data to support a Hobbesian view of reality.
For listeners who might not have read Thomas Hobbes lately, His 1651 book, Leviathan, argued that the natural state of humanity without government is a war of every man against every man.
Where life is nasty, brutish, and short.
Exactly. So how do you escape the brutish state of nature? You need a Leviathan. You need a sovereign power with a literal monopoly on violence to force everyone to behave.
Exactly. Riker argues that the historical decline in violence wasn't caused by people suddenly deciding to be nice.
Right.
It was caused by disciplined, stoic, aggressive men building a legal framework and monopolizing violence to deter criminals and invaders.
Yeah.
Men tamed the chaos.
Therefore, Riker argues, when modern institutions declare war on traditional masculinity, they are literally declaring war on the only shield that keeps civilization from slipping back into the violent state of nature. That sets up a devastating paradox. If the biological reality and historical data prove that society requires this stoic, protective male energy to survive, well, what happens when the legal framework of that society actively turns around and punishes the men providing it?
That paradox is the complete focus of Section 4. Riker diagnoses the collapse of the domestic sphere.
Okay, so moving from the state to the home.
Right. Arguing that the law shifted from the objective governance of the Enlightenment to subjective, emotion-driven dictates. Dictates designed to coddle female fragility while actively punishing male duty.
He zeroes in on the 1960s as the accelerator for this collapse, specifically Lyndon B. Johnson's 1964 Great Society welfare programs.
Which is a very common focal point in these discussions.
It is. But Riker claims these programs were not an act of governmental compassion at all. They were a systemic weapon used to destroy the nuclear family.
He focuses intensely on the mechanics of the Aid to Families with Dependent Children program. Riker explains how the monetary structure of these welfare checks essentially required the physical absence of a male provider in the household.
Right. If a father was present and working, the family lost their benefits.
Yes. So the government literally stepped in and said to mothers, "We will pay your rent and buy your food, but only if you physically expel your husband from the premises."
The state literally replaced the patriarch with a government check. It became a surrogate husband.
Riker links this financial wedge to the explicit ideological goals of second-wave feminism. He cites Carol Hanish's influential 1969 essay, "The Personal is Political."
And what's the connection there?
He argues the movement explicitly sought to dismantle the nuclear family to expand state reliance. Furthermore, he points to the tragic vindication of Daniel Patrick Moynihan's 1965 report.
The Moynihan Report.
Yes. Moynihan mathematically predicted that incentivizing single motherhood would lead to the collapse of the black family in America, warning that withdrawing the masculine shield doesn't create a feminist utopia. It creates generational poverty and skyrocketing crime.
But he also doesn't let conservatives off the hook here.
Oh, not at all.
He points straight at Ronald Reagan, who, as governor of California in 1969, signed the Family Law Act, ushering in no-fault divorce.
Right. Riker views no-fault divorce as the legal mechanism that removed any required justification for breaking the domestic contract.
Allowing a family to be dissolved simply because of a subjective change in feelings, which ties back to his whole thesis about subjective emotionalism taking over.
What's fascinating here is how the book then merges this legal decay with the biological revolution of the contraceptive pill.
The FDA's 1960 approval of Inovid.
Yes, Riker views the pill as an existential turning point. The exact moment the linear Judeo-Christian bond between sex and procreation was surgically severed.
He argues this unleashed female hypergamy, right?
Yes.
The evolutionary drive for a woman to seek a mate of higher status. Because before the pill, the immense biological risk of pregnancy acted as this huge societal constraint. Women had to choose men who would stick around and actually provide.
But decoupling sex from the consequence of child rearing, Riker says the pill bypassed the ancient selection mechanisms that literally built civilization.
And this leads to perhaps Riker's most controversial legal analysis in the whole book, his thorough dismantling of the 1981 Duluth model of domestic violence.
Yes, this is a major focal point.
The Duluth model is brought up constantly in men's rights circles. For the listener, what is the actual mechanism of this model, and why does Riker view it as a linchpin of institutional capture?
Well, the Duluth model was developed by Ellen Pence in Minnesota. It is an ideological framework that currently informs police training and domestic violence policies across much of the Western world.
Right.
Riker vehemently argues that it's not based on rigorous scientific inquiry. In fact, he classifies it straight up as a feminist conspiracy theory.
Because of how it assumes guilt?
Exactly. The model explicitly assumes that all domestic violence is a unilateral tool of patriarchal control. It states that men batter women strictly to maintain societal dominance, and that if a woman uses violence, it is exclusively in self-defense.
So it literally preassigns guilt based on gender rather than looking at the specific empirical facts of an altercation.
Precisely. Riker points out that this ideological framework completely ignores decades of empirical research.
Which shows what?
He cites data showing that domestic violence is frequently bidirectional, meaning both partners engage in physical altercations. He cites studies showing women frequently initiate the violence, and that lesbian relationships experience domestic violence at rates equal to or higher than heterosexual relationships, which, he points out, mathematically shatters the theory that the violence is inherently rooted in male patriarchal control.
Wow.
Riker argues the Duluth model removes female agency entirely. It creates a justice system that is no longer blind, but biologically biased against men.
Okay, so if a man is surrounded by a legal and corporate structure that assumes his guilt by default, as Riker argues with the Duluth model and HR guidelines, it forces a massive question.
It does.
How does he actually walk into a corporate office or navigate a marriage today without stepping on a landmine? I mean, how does the red-pilled man fight back?
This is the pivot of the manifesto. Riker moves from diagnosing the disease to prescribing the cure.
The tactical warfare.
Yes. He outlines tactical warfare against what he calls the NPC matrix, non-player characters.
Meaning people who just blindly follow the script.
Right. These are the ideologically possessed individuals who do not think critically, but merely regurgitate approved leftist slogans. Riker provides explicit rules of engagement to short-circuit their programming.
The very first tactic in his field guide is the Socratic method.
Riker instructs men to absolutely never offer a counter-argument when confronted by an activist screaming about systemic oppression or equity.
Because counter-arguing assumes you are in a logical debate.
Exactly. And you're not. Instead, you demand empirical definitions. You calmly ask, define systemic oppression. Show me the specific statute or law that enforces it. Point to the empirical data.
You literally force them to show their work.
And because these individuals have often spent their entire academic and professional lives in echo chambers, where emotional declarations are just automatically accepted as facts.
They don't know how to respond.
Right. Forcing them into the rigid, uncompromising framework of Aristotelian logic causes a psychological collapse. They literally do not have the vocabulary to defend their premise objectively.
Once you strip them of their linguistic armor, Riker introduces the gray rock method. Now, in clinical psychology, gray rocking is a technique used to survive interactions with a narcissist, right? You make yourself as uninteresting and unresponsive as a gray rock so the narcissist just gets bored and leaves.
Yes. And Riker applies this directly to ideological combat.
Yeah.
He frames it as the tactical withdrawal of masculine energy.
How does that work in practice?
The text suggests that the female-coded left subconsciously relies on hijacking a man's innate protector instinct. When they rage, cry, or throw a tantrum, they are trying to trigger your desire to soothe them or engage with them.
Okay, so they want a reaction.
To defeat this, Riker says you must stand perfectly still. You completely refuse to validate their hysteria. By starving them of your reaction, you deny them the emotional fuel required for what he terms victim value harvesting.
Victim value harvesting. So you just let them spin out in the void.
Basically, yeah.
And he pairs this with the non-apology protocol. Riker is absolutely adamant about this. He says, never, under any circumstances, apologize to the mob.
He is very clear on that. In the current cultural matrix, an apology is never accepted as a gesture of goodwill or an olive branch.
It's blood in the water.
Right. Riker argues an apology is a blood signature. It's a formal admission of guilt that merely signals to the predators that you are weak and ready to be consumed. It just validates their false premise that their subjective feelings outrank your objective reality.
One of the most striking and probably controversial tactics he suggests to use instead of an apology is the dismissive smirk.
Yes, he gets incredibly specific, but the physiology of resistance here.
He argues that when a crowd is screaming in your face, getting angry shows them they've breached your defenses.
Exactly.
Instead, you deploy a dismissive smirk. It's a micro-expression of total physiological mastery. It signals absolute psychological supremacy over their outrage.
You are telling the room that this screening activist isn't a threat. They're just an amusing, slightly embarrassing spectacle.
And Riker provides historical masterclasses in this exact rhetorical dominance, right?
He does. He points to Winston Churchill during the 1930s. Churchill was surrounded by weak bureaucrats pushing the appeasement of Nazi Germany.
But Churchill didn't try to gently persuade them?
No, he dismantled their authority with aggressive, masculine contempt. He openly mocked their cowardice. Riker notes that bureaucrats instantly crumble when their fake authority is met with raw, unapologetic contempt rather than polite deference.
He pulls that exact same dynamic into the modern era, analyzing Donald Trump's 2016 campaign. Now, love him or hate him, Riker views Trump's rhetorical style as a perfect execution of this matrix-breaking dominance.
Yes, because Trump didn't bother circulating white papers on policy nuances.
Right, he dropped psychological anchors, low-energy Jeb, crooked Hillary.
Riker says these weren't just crude insult, they were surgical strikes that completely bypassed the mainstream media's linguistic defenses. He implanted a permanent frame of weakness onto his opponents, seizing the epistemological high ground.
But Riker's tactical manual does not stop at the office door or the debate stage. I mean, he takes this exact framework of dominance and applies it directly to the bedroom.
He mounts a brutal critique of modern romance.
He absolutely eviscerates the modern egalitarian model of marriage, where everything is 50-50 and everyone is exactly the same. He calls it a parasitic lie that destroys romance.
To dismantle the egalitarian model, Riker introduces the law of polarity.
Polarity.
Yes. For listeners unfamiliar, think of this like Newton's third law of motion applied to human attraction. You cannot have a spark without a positive and a negative charge.
Okay, so the masculine and feminine energies.
Exactly. The masculine energy must push, providing structure, direction, and unyielding authority. The feminine energy must pull, providing emotion, nurture, and flow.
Riker's premise here is that biological hypergamy means women are fundamentally sexually attracted to men who possess undeniable power and rational authority.
Right. But the egalitarian marriage model demands that the man constantly compromise, suppress his authority, and act like a co-manager rather than a leader.
Therefore, Riker concludes, the egalitarian model mathematically starves the female libido. It guarantees a dead bedroom because you cannot negotiate primal desire over a chore chart.
To counter this domestic decay, Riker prescribes two behavioral concepts for men: benevolent disregard and amused mastery.
What's benevolent disregard?
Benevolent disregard is the practice of compassionately but firmly ignoring endless emotional noise. If a partner comes to a man with a frantic, emotionally charged problem, he does not sit down and process her feelings like one of her girlfriends.
So what does he do?
He assesses the reality of the situation, fixes the structural problem with ruthless efficiency, and decisively ends the discussion.
And amused mastery is how a man handles the inevitable pushback, right? Because Riker warns that the second a man actually assumes this patriarchal authority, his partner is going to subconsciously test him to make sure he's strong enough to hold it.
Correct. When a partner hurls emotional hysteria or picks a fight, Riker asserts she is not looking for a logical debate. She is throwing a kinetic stress test at her protector to ensure he is an immovable wall.
So if the man gets angry or defensive, he fails the test, proving he is fragile.
Instead, he must utilize amused mastery. He treats the emotional chaos with the metaframe of an experienced, deeply unbothered father figure watching a toddler throw a tantrum over a broken toy.
He responds with warm, high-status condescension. He might chuckle, use a playful, calibrated insult to mock her bad attitude, but never attacking her deep insecurities.
Exactly. Refusing to take her outbursts seriously. By doing this, the man proves he cannot be emotionally manipulated. He is the rock.
If we pull all these threads together, from the Socratic method in the boardroom to amused mastery in the living room, Riker has essentially constructed a unified theory of masculine survival.
The absolute core of his philosophy is the categorical refusal to be emotionally compromised by a culture that worships fragility.
Which brings us to the culmination of his manifesto, Section 6, where he shifts from individual survival to civilizational strategy.
Because just surviving the NPC matrix isn't the end goal for him.
You have to transcend it. He introduces the concept of the anti-fragile frame. Now, we've talked about the ego antibody, which is about not breaking under pressure. But anti-fragility is a concept popularized by Nassim Taleb.
Right. It means you don't just survive an attack. The attack actually makes you stronger. The chaos fuels your growth.
In Riker's paradigm, a red-pilled man uses the kinetic outrage of the woke mob as high-octane fuel to elevate his own status.
Yes, when the culture tries to cancel you, their hysterical assault becomes the engine of your public triumph.
To understand how to reverse engineer their attacks, Riker deeply analyzes the foundational playbook of the modern left. Saul Alinsky's 1971 manual, Rules for Radicals.
Riker points out a detail about Alinsky's book that often gets swept under the rug. Alinsky literally dedicated the book to Lucifer, calling him the very first radical who rebelled against the establishment.
Which is wild. Riker views this book as the operational source code for the institutional capture we've been discussing.
Alinsky's most famous tactical rule is pick the target, freeze it, personalize it, and polarize it.
And Riker dissects this, right?
He does, noting that it is entirely devoid of Greek dialectic reason. The left utilizes this rule to completely bypass the intellect and strike directly at the emotional jugular.
They rely on the fact that decent, traditional men will flinch and try to defend their character. They mistakenly believe they are engaged in a rational debate,
when in reality, they are being subjected to coordinated psychological warfare.
Riker highlights two massive recent examples where institutions completely collapsed because they tried to reason with this Alinsky-style warfare. First, the 2018 Supreme Court confirmation hearings for Brett Kavanaugh.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Riker frames the Kavanaugh hearings as a grotesque national spectacle where the foundational principles of Anglo-Saxon jurisprudence were completely abandoned.
Specifically, the presumption of innocence and the demand for verifiable evidence.
Yes, those were entirely suspended. He argues the left didn't care about the empirical truth of the allegations. Their goal was to deploy emotional terrorism to humiliate and destroy a patriarchal figure on live television.
And the second example is the terrifying collapse of academia. The 2017 protests at Evergreen State College involving biology professor Brett Weinstein. Let's break down exactly what happened there.
So, Evergreen State College had a tradition called the Day of Absence, where minority students would voluntarily leave campus to highlight their contributions.
But in 2017, the activists inverted the event.
Yes, they demanded that all white students and faculty physically vacate the campus.
And Brett Weinstein, a lifelong progressive but fundamentally a rationalist, politely refused. He stated that demanding people leave a space based on their race is a dangerous precedent.
And the response to his logical email wasn't a debate, it was a literal mob.
A mob of students hunted him down, trapped him in a hallway, and screamed obscenities at him.
When Weinstein attempted to use reason, calmly asking to dialogue with them, they just screamed louder. They physically intimidated him and demanded his resignation.
The crucial point for Riker is not just the mob's behavior, but the administration's response.
Right. The college president ordered the police to stand down and capitulated entirely to the students.
Riker views this as definitive proof that gynocentrism inevitably rots the very institutions of higher learning that men originally built. The trireme literally sank.
So, if the universities are gone, the HR departments are captured, and the family courts are rigged, what is the final move?
Right. Riker clearly doesn't want men to just stand in the rubble and argue with ideologically possessed zombies forever.
He is incredibly pragmatic about the path forward. He introduces the strategy of jurisdictional arbitrage.
Jurisdictional arbitrage.
Yes. Riker calls for a militant, calculated withdrawal of masculine competence from the decaying state apparatus. We must stop trying to save institutions that hate us and instead build parallel structures.
It reminds me of the quote from Archimedes, "Give me a place to stand and a lever long enough and I will move the world."
That's a very apt comparison.
Riker is saying the Matrix has stolen the ground beneath our feet, so we have to go find new ground. And he provides a highly specific, modern blueprint for what this looks like.
He details the example of an entrepreneur who executed this jurisdictional arbitrage flawlessly. This man realized his corporation was being infiltrated by woke HR mandates, so he packed up his business and his family and moved to Wyoming.
Why Wyoming specifically?
Because of the state's legislative architecture. Wyoming pioneered the 2021 DAO LLC laws, decentralized autonomous organization laws.
Oh, okay.
This entrepreneur utilized these specific legal structures to permanently shield his capital and business operations from corporate leftist infiltration.
Furthermore, he moved his family to a county with absolute, unyielding castle doctrine laws for self-defense and robust protections for homeschooling to ensure his children would never be exposed to public school indoctrination.
He drew a line in the sand. He established his own sovereign patriarchy simply by crossing state lines. He voted with his feet and his capital.
Riker uses this to prove that the NPC matrix is incredibly vulnerable to geographic and financial withdrawal. They cannot harvest your value if you remove it from their jurisdiction.
Riker terms this the masculine renaissance. And it is important to note he is not advocating for a nostalgic retreat to the 1950s.
Right, it's not about going backwards.
He is advocating for an aggressive, evolutionary leap forward. This renaissance involves creating network states, establishing men's-only private gyms, funding martial arts academies, and building private educational networks that teach rigorous Aristotelian logic completely outside the purview of the state.
So, what does this all mean? We have covered a colossal amount of ground today.
We certainly have.
The sheer density of Conrad Reicher's thesis in Enlightened Hostility is just staggering. It is a full-throated, unapologetic call for men to reclaim the intellectual, verbal, and stoic heritage of the Western patriarchs.
He is demanding that men survive this post-truth, emotionally sentimental era by becoming unbreakable monoliths of logic and authority.
The entire manifesto operates on the fundamental, unyielding premise that truth exists entirely independently of our feelings about it.
Exactly. Riker has systematically attempted to deconstruct the gynocentric narrative. He argues that traditional masculinity, with its stoicism, its aggression, and its heavy burden of protective duty, is not a toxic pathology.
It's the very engine that keeps the darkness at bay.
Right. He has traced this history from the war galleys of Athens to the HR departments of corporate America, offering a tactical manual for psychological resistance.
He's telling men to stop apologizing for their nature. Use the Socratic method to expose the emptiness of modern buzzwords. Hold the line in your romantic relationships by providing unshakable boundaries instead of validating chaos.
Be the iron wall that the barbarians break themselves against.
Which leaves us with a profound, lingering provocation. A question that extends even beyond Riker's extensive historical analysis.
If, as the book claims, civilizations truly collapse when they begin prioritizing emotional comfort over harsh, necessary truths, are we currently witnessing a uniquely modern phenomenon driven by 20th century feminism and Marxist theory? Or is this simply the inevitable cyclical twilight of every great empire? Throughout human history, from the fall of Rome to the present day, do all prosperous societies eventually soften?
That is the ultimate question.
Do they rot from within under the weight of their own luxury and safety? Until a harder, more aggressive, unapologetic culture inevitably arrives at the gates to replace them.
That is a terrifying and honestly necessary thought to mull over. Are we just waiting for the historical cycle to reset violently? You, the listener, have an immense amount to think about. And if you want to dive into the raw source code of these ideas, you need to read the text yourself.
I highly recommend doing so to fully grasp the arguments.
Once again, head over to Amazon Kindle and Google Playbooks right now to pick up your copy of Enlightened Hostility, a red-pilled manifesto of masculine verbal aggression. And make sure you follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack for his latest updates.
It is a text engineered to shock the system. Regardless of your personal political alignment, it stands as an undeniably rigorous articulation of the modern red-pilled worldview.
And understanding it is crucial to understanding the shifting cultural tides. Before you go, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel so you never miss a deep dive, and share this with someone who needs to hear it.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for joining this massive exploration. We'll see you next time, but until then. Remember, the next time you look at the blueprint of a civilization, ask yourself exactly what kind of fire it took to forge the steel.